we have to understand what it is that God was telling us, and I'll talk about that later on. So as a Reformed Jew, I understand Orthodoxy as seeing Torah as God-given, and thus limiting the human role to reinterpreting Torah. Not ending it, just limiting it according to patterns which God has given us and according to precedents set out by the masters of previous generations. God communicated the words directly to Moses on Sinai to transmit them to the children of Israel and ultimately for all time. And in so doing, God mandated all aspects of Jewish observance. Now, I believe Reformed Judaism moves the emphasis, if you will, from the divine to the human, but perhaps not in the way that some of you may think. Within Reformed Judaism, the emphasis on revelation is upon the human response to God's reality. God may communicate the words directly, but we human beings, imperfect as we all are, limited innately by our own humanity, cannot fully understand or fully comprehend those words. Our emphasis then becomes more upon partnership than upon receipt, more upon than the brit, the covenant, than upon matan Torah, than upon the giving of the Torah. And my sense is that conservative Judaism assigns the community a major role. One's people, rather than oneself, is revelation's most reliable source and repository. Now, without a doubt, and Dr. Shah quotes from some of the Reform rabbis of more than a century ago, there were those Reformed Jews who posited human authorship of Torah. The problem, of course, with doing so is that the authority behind Jewish law then is also human. No longer is God the final arbiter of what must remain fixed in Jewish observance and what can be altered, but rather our own rational consciences. Our minds and hearts have priority over ancient precedents, and if we go down that road, obviously the question has to arise again, what does "and God said" really mean? Now, it's not, as I understand Orthodoxy, that God gave verbal instructions. And surely not as some Jews who might call themselves humanists, which I find to be an oxymoron, but that would be a separate conversation, who cannot conceive a God. Rather, these texts are responses to the sacred other, responses to God. God speaks becomes people understand. If the first set of tablets which Moses brought down from Sinai, in some way, and I'll talk about the anthropomorphisms in the text later on, but in some way we understand that first set of tablets. How did God give them to Moses? Somehow God's self, the finger of God, somehow God burned in the letters into those tablets themselves. But as Moses came down the mountain, Moses saw his people around the molten calf and took those tablets and shattered them. And the second set of tablets this time were done differently. The second set of tablets were no longer at the finger or directly somehow done by God. These were in some way communicated to Moses, which Moses in some way engraved on those tablets. So somehow then, in doing this, God speaks becomes people understand. And so revelation is our response to God's reality. For us, covenant can be understood as an ongoing relationship with God, requiring each one of us as Jews to engage in that relationship. And as we confront the texts, somehow in the process, enter into dialogue with God. So the text we have, again, a human understanding of that revelation might not yet fully convey God's word. And beyond that, we today have further problems. We encounter the texts. We're supposed to encounter the texts in the original Hebrew. Because as you know already, translation is already commentary. Even if it's only the first layer. And even then, for us today, there remains the challenge of taking Hebrew thousands of years old and trying to understand its words. I have to admit, I'm a native English speaker. I have trouble understanding Shakespeare, let alone Chaucer. And none of those authors, Shakespeare is 500 years old, Chaucer is, help me, 800 years old, 900? And with Torah, I'm talking 3,300 years, perhaps. So, I know that perhaps in past centuries, as Dr. Shah and I both pointed out, Reformed Judaism talked about revelation as inspiration, or as human striving to attain some moral or ethical ideal. But that's not how most Reformed Jews talk about Torah today. So speaking for most Reformed Jews, albeit not all, we affirm that Torah is the foundation of Jewish life. We cherish the truths revealed to us in Torah, God's ongoing revelation to our people, and that ongoing record of our relationship with God. Torah is a manifestation of Ahavat Olam, God's everlasting love for the Jewish